Hi, my dearest of family. Well, today we are going to be looking at the very last conjunction happening between Eris and Chiron. And this is the third conjunction. This is the final conjunction between these three. However, when Chiron goes into Taurus and then it retrogrades back into Aries, they are going to be close enough, but they are not going to be making any more conjunction for about 50, 55 years. So, of course, this is therefore an important conjunction. So I'm going to be breaking this down on a personal as well as on a collective level. I would like to mention that this is going to be a little bit of a sensitive topic. We're going to talk about some of these wars as well that are happening in the world because unfortunately, this conjunction is about that. So I wanted to stay away from it, but then I decided that kind of like we all have got the right to know a little bit more about the astrology of the wars behind. And I think this is one of the aspects that is in kind of like charge of that. So, but I would like to invite you to join my membership program. You can now choose the very first month for half price. You can check out my teaching style. There are approximately about 250 courses and webinars available, and it's going to be able to help you a lot to understand your own chart better from a lot of psychological and practical point of view as well. So check it out on my website, AstroViktor.com, and I would be grateful if you joined my YouTube as well. So please press like, make a comment. I've noticed that 60% of my viewers are still not part of my community, and I would love to welcome you with me. So let's get started. So we have got the very last Chiron and Eris conjunction in the sign of Aries. So like I said, this is the third one. We had three, this is the third conjunction. The very first one happened in 2025, May 27th. And that happened on 25 degree of Aries. Then we had the second conjunction on October 9th, also on 25 degree of Aries as well. And then we are going to be experiencing the third and the final conjunction on March 19th, and that is on 24 degree 59 minutes, so almost on 25 degree as well. So do let me know in the comment box below, do you have any planets on the 25th degree of the cardinal signs, such as Aries, Cancer, Libra, or Capricorn, because then this is going to be very, very important constellation for you. And this is not just a day. This is most likely we are talking about a few years of building up to this moment when you're going to have to be able to stand up for yourself. This is about a radical ways of self-assertion. So we have got Chiron involved here, which is the wounded healer meets Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. So this is not just kind of like a little bit of a minor inconvenience, is we are looking at the pain of being ignored, being marginalized by others. And what we need to learn is that we are not a people pleaser anymore. We are going to be standing up for our own rights. So this is the final hit of the cycle. So we are kind of like moving from that shock of the initial wound towards more of a definitive integration or a breaking point that is going to be leading to a certain type of a breakthrough. So looking at these two archetypes, Chiron in Aries, this is the wound to right to exist. It's the feeling that one's very identity or presence is a burden or is wrong. While Aries, in the sign of Aries, this is the warrior spirit of the outcast. Aries doesn't just want a seat at the table. She is willing to flip the table if the system is unjust. So the story behind Aries is that she wasn't invited to the wedding as a goddess. Every single god and goddess were invited to the wedding party on Olympus, but she was the one who wasn't. The reason being is because she was always a troublemaker, and they didn't want any trouble on that wedding party. And they had to be paying the price for it because she created a war. So, therefore, it feels like for this final conjunction, it's kind of like the weaponization of vulnerability. Often we tend to be thinking of the healing kind of like as a quiet process, right? Because, often Chiron is something to do with internal shifting. But this time around, that healing is kind of like an act of war. It's when people are saying that, the thing that hurts me is exactly what makes me powerful as well. Or I cannot stand anymore the fact that people are trying to hurt me, so I'm going to stand up for myself and I'm going to be rebellious type of energy. So that's the reason why I would be checking if you have got any planets on 24 or 25 degree of the cardinal signs, because it's a little bit of a high octane type of fiery energy there. This is about having to name that situation or that demon, that person who is causing you feeling outcasted somehow. So if the first two passes back in May and October 2025 brought up an old insecurity or certain type of a social friction in your life, then this third pass in March 2026 is about the resolution period. It's about cutting out the feeling that I don't belong anywhere. And it's the realization that I don't need to belong because I am my own boss. And Aries is about exposing kind of like the apple of this gold, basically. So therefore, on a global level, this could manifest as like very bold individuals standing up against institutional gaslighting, for example. Or it could talk to us about certain type of a psychological breakthrough as well regarding, those invisible illnesses or traumatic experiences, because we can really go down on a memory lane with this combination as well. It's kind of like remembering when exactly we got rejected. For example, if it happens in your fourth house and then you've got a planet there, such as, for example, the moon, which represents our memories, then you might realize that at certain age you were outcasted. You were not allowed to be the unapologetic version of yourself. And with Chiron and Aries, unfortunately, we can see kind of like a surge in movements as well, because we demand being recognized. We demand being out, like we demand being recognized for being outcasted at one point, and we want justice with that. So, in the Sabian symbols, these degrees often relate to the ability to focus, and these are powerful degrees. 25-degree Aries is often associated with kind of like a double promise. So this degree has got kind of like a dual nature. And what I mean by the double promise is that two things potentially are being promised to us, but maybe none of them are being delivered. And this is going to be making us pretty angry. Well, the 24-degree is very much about blown backwards by the wind. That's what the Sabian symbols would say about that. So often this 24-degree is a temporary setback. But that setback is forcing us for a more authentic path forward. So, since this is the very final pass, you might want to be looking back to that 2025 May period and whatever kind of like discord or strife began, then it's somehow reaching its ultimate resolution right now. It's about not feeling or not suffering anymore due to certain type of a chaos in our life, but we are going to be mastering that. So I went back in, a bit of a history, and then I looked at what happened in the world around those dates. because those might be able to give us a bit of a clue what we can expect. And of course, like I said, one of the manifestation of this aspect is conflicts. So there was quite a sharp escalation in the India-Pakistan conflict back in May, and featuring some missile strikes and air combat between the two country. So this really reflects the raw, aggressive energy of Aries being wounded, and it's triggered by this code, which is Eris. A ceasefire was eventually mediated, but that initial kind of like flare up was very much of a classic Aries signature. In Argentina, the president decided to withdraw from the World Health Organization. That's kind of like a major Aries style move of rejecting a global establishment as well. And in Vietnam, around that time, deliberations began on ending the death penalty for certain crimes, which is actually a move towards healing, right? Chiron, with a legal system known for its severity. Now, the second conjunction happened on October 9th. This was the week of the landmark of the Gaza peace breakthrough. After 2 years of kind of like war, Israel and Hamas reached an initial agreement to exchange hostages and prisoners. In astrology, the second pass of a cycle often brings a renegotiation. So, of course, the renegotiation happened here connected to the initial wound. But Eris and Chiron could really talk to us about the rise of the feminine warrior as well, actually. And that's a very literal manifestation of Aries because she was a female warrior. She was a female outsider. And in Japan, the very first female prime minister got elected in October. Also, I think this archetype could talk to us about exposing the underworld as well. And Didi was sentenced during this window as well. You know, and this is kind of like a high-profile discord, exposing the deep-seated systematic wounds pretty much. So we might be able to see these type of connections. So you might be wondering what to expect with this third conjunction. Well, um, a third conjunction is often about a closure. So I can imagine this is kind of like a closure of a Gaza chapter. Since the second pass brought a ceasefire, so the March pass may represent the final difficult integration of that peace or, a certain type of permanent structural change in the region. So that could be one of the manifestation as well. But we might be seeing a final showdown, for example, in certain type of space sectors, like the SpaceX and so forth, because there were certain type of legal battles seen back in May 2025 as well. But on a personal level, you might want to ask yourself, what fight did you start back in May 2025, which you are ready to finish right now, potentially walking away from it, or kind of like closing that chapter down in your life. Now, we can go back in the past and then look at what went down, with previous conjunctions. We had one in 1971, and then we had one in 1917 as well. The 1917 actually happened in the sign of Pisces, while the 1971 happened on 8th degree of Aries. But you can go back yourself and then have a look at what went down around that time. I think the 1917 one, which was in the sign of Pisces, happened also around 24 degree of Pisces on top of my head. But that was about the Russian Revolution, that was the World War One. And then in 1971, which was in the sign of Aries, but that was somewhere around 8 to 11 degree, of course. Um, you know, Somehow at that time the me decade began. I think the 70s was kind of like a bridge where the focus turned to self-actualization. And that was actually the year when the Pentagon Papers were published as well, which is really a classic Aries apple of this cold scenario. And I find it super interesting that, the Epstein files got, published right now as well. Of course, God knows whether those files are legit or not, so let's not get into that topic because some of you might think it's not legit, some of you might think it is legit. I cannot make a decision on that, but surely that's an Eris and Chiron archetype too. And even, back in 1971, there was this Swiss women's suffragettes movement happening as well, which is again very much of an Aries, the female force of discord. It's about, finally gain the right to exist in the political system. So surely I would say that Chiron and Aries together is about certain type of a brave activism, and it's about sovereignty. So while 1971 was also in the sign of Aries, but it happened at the beginning of the sign, the current conjunction is very much at the end of Aries. And the late degrees of the sign often represents the mastery of exhaustion. So this isn't necessarily just about starting a fight. It's about more of a finishing the fight for self-respect, something that has been brewing in the air for decades. Like I said, Chiron will be back in the sign of Aries this year, and then the final pass into the sign of Taurus is just going to be happening in 2027. So therefore, I would like to remind you that I don't think it's finishing very soon. I think it's if there is going to be an escalation, it's going to be happening in April, May. But I'm going to come on to that in a short while. Of course, considering what happens now in Israel and Iran and the USA, um, I think this is also very much connected to this Eris and Chiron archetype. We know that the first strike happened on February 28th. That was quite a massive strike that killed the supreme leader as well. And that's pretty much, the Aries response to it. We started seeing this discord within Iran, internal protests and the leadership vacuum and, the discord across the region. Of course, Iran has retaliated with 235 waves of missile and drone attacks. Unfortunately, this is somehow a Aries response. Um, and in the sign of Aries, which is kind of like the fighter. Aries represents the one who is pushed out and fights back eventually. So, of course, that's why Iran is kind of like doing that type of a response. But this is the final breaking point. So, what I would say is that if in the next 1 week or so, someone is going to make a statement or a kind of like a underbelt type of attack against, let's say, Iran, or Iran makes something that is unacceptable, so it can go really two ways, then I think this war is going to escalate even further, unfortunately. If this is more of a quiet period and then we are coming, because this is the final pass, like I said, this could be a closure of something as well, then the war should be ending. So, of course, this is going to be very interesting to see how it might play out in the very first, in the next 1 week. But of course, Chiron would like to heal certain type of connections here. Chiron element is showing up as kind of like an eco side, you know. So, so that's on a humanitarian level. Chiron has got this humanitarian side to it. Remember, Chiron was a half a centaur or centaur and half a human. So it embraced the human element of suffering as well because he was accidentally shot in his foot. He did it to himself by mistake. So Chiron sees that, maybe certain type of moves can really trigger other people, kind of like the minority, because Aries represents the minority as well. So I think on one hand, this is about direct confrontation. It's kind of like a transition from a proxy war to a more direct, open state-on-state warfare. It's a little bit of a leadership vacuum here. It can represent the death of a long-standing leader, for example. Or this is the price of sovereignty. That's very much of a chironic wound here. What does it cost for me to be independent? Is it worth it? We can ask so many questions of those. Now, of course, if we start thinking about a little bit more on a personal level. Oh, before actually I get into that, I would like to remind you that Mars is going to be reaching 20 degree of Aries around May, 4th of May. And it's going to be having an exact square to Jupiter on 20 degree of Cancer. And it's a 5 degree separation. But this could really talk to us about that things can escalate a lot further. So Mars is going to enter the sign of Aries on April 9th. So that's going to reignite the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in the sign of Aries. Then April 19th, Mars is going to be making a conjunction to Saturn around 8 degree. And that's a bit of a forced hold there. It could be a structural blow in a conflict, for example. And then Mars reaches that 20 degree of Aries on 4th of May. So it gets into that hot zone. This is where Chiron and Aries meet around those degrees. And around the 13th of May, Mars will conjunct Aries. So I think May is going to be an interesting month to see how these energies are going to be playing out. And that could talk to us about, for example, when Mars reaches that 20 degree zone, that could be a reignition. Let's say if we are creating a peace or a stalemate, somehow being reached around March 19th, then I feel like it's going to get tested somehow in May. And in a war scenario, this is often when logistics have caught up and the secondary, more aggressive wave of action begins. But on a personal level, this is the day where the discord moves from kind of like, a thought to more of a physical action. So this is about you stopping to talk about something and I'm going to start doing it. So that's something that I definitely wanted to touch base on for you because I think we are just in an initial phase right now. But let's go back to the personal level. I think this is about the reclamation of your primal self. This is not necessarily a polite way of asking you to make self-improvements. This is about integrating that you are an outcasted person, but you don't have to be ashamed of who you are, and you don't have to be shamed into certain type of a kind of like a silence. Aries is about I am. So what part of my survival instincts have I traded away for a sense of safety? You might want to be asking yourself that question, especially if you have got any planets on that particular 24, 25 degree. This transit is the ultimate no. So if you have been overextending yourself to keep the peace, that this Eris and Chiron conjunction, alongside with the Mars Jupiter square, it might force you into a situation where you must choose yourself, or it can lead to a total burnout. So imagine that it happens in your 10th house. Then it's about quitting a job that devalues you, or finally setting a hard boundary with a family member who uses guilt to control you. Let's say if it happens on your fourth house ruler, or it is in your fourth house actually. Chiron in Aries is often about the wound of not being enough. And Aries is kind of like the fury of being uninvited to something. So these two together can create a person who no longer cares about kind of like the gold apple, so therefore the social approval. So therefore, let's say I'm going to be launching a business. I'm going to be doing a creative project. Everyone might be telling you that, oh, it's too risky, it's too much, don't do that in this current climate. And then you are kind of like, I don't give a crap about what you are saying. So if it's about launching a creative project, for example, it might be falling then into your fifth house. Often we are told to heal through letting go something. But actually, this transit is asking you to stand your ground. Because the wound heals when the warrior finally wins the battle for self-respect. Especially if you have been, kind of like sidelined by others. So here are some reflective questions that you might want to ask yourself in the next couple of months. Where am I still asking for permission to exist in my full power? Remember, Aries is about the right to take up space, basically. What part of myself have I rejected because I was told it was too aggressive or it was too difficult? This is your Aries power here. Then, am I avoiding a necessary conflict because I'm afraid of the discord it will cause? Or you might want to ask yourself another question. What if I stop trying to fix my insecurities and instead used it as a weapon for change? Then what would I do today? So these are some of the questions that you might want to be reflecting on, especially if you've got any planets on 25 degree of the cardinal signs. So how do you see the Chiron and Aries conjunction? Of course, it's been boiling for a while, and I'm curious to hear your opinion as well. So thank you for being here. Please subscribe, like the video, comment on the video, share your views as well, or potentially you can even share the video with others too. Take care, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.